Angin kencang itu menuntut satu kemahuan, menegaskan satu pendirian. Bahawa bahasa Melayu itu satu perjuangan kemerdekaan, lambang perpaduan kebangsaan. 22 Jun 1956, hasil daripada kesaktian lidah rakyat, kami lahir sebagai institusi keramat dengan nama Dewan Bahasa dan Pustaka. Angin semilir bertiup perlahan-lahan memupuk rasa cinta dan penghayatan. Kami percaya ubur perjuangan mendaulatkan bahasa kebangsaan perlu sentiasa disemarakkan nyalanya. Angin kencang itu kembali datang membawa suara bantahan, meluahkan rasa kekecewaan. Sesungguhnya, bahasa Melayu itu mesti dipertahankan. Angin timur dan barat membawa harumnya wangian bahasa Melayu ke seluruh tanah air tercinta, melahirkan ribuan cerdik pandai, merentasi pelbagai bidang ilmu, memperkaya khazanah kesusasteraan, mendepani segala perubahan zaman. Kami hadir dengan semangat dan harapan memandaikan generasi masa hadapan yang tetap bertunjangkan kebangsaan. Angin sendalu menderu lembut, lalu membiaskan kedinginan. Dalam dunia yang sentiasa mengejar kepesatan, kami akan memastikan bahasa Melayu tidak akan ketinggalan dengan penghasilan produk dan perkhidmatan yang akan memberikan nilai ekonomi. Angin pancaroba sering berubah-ubah tiupannya, membawa cabaran dan halangan. Kami tetap akan membakar semangat, memupuk rasa kebersamaan agar anda sentiasa berdiri bangga di mata dunia dengan identiti kebangsaan yang tidak pernah sesekali goyah. Kami sedar angin akan terus bertiup yang akan membuatkan anda berhadapan keraguan kesetiaan. Tetapi kami akan tetap berdiri teguh kerana kami satu-satunya petugas zaman yang akan tetap mempertahankan. Kerana kami Dewan Bahasa dan Pustaka lahir dari restu jiwa pahlawan. Kami ucapkan dengan sepenuh keazaman, bahasa itu jiwa bangsa. Angin kencang itu menuntut satu kemahuan, menegaskan satu pendirian. Bahawa bahasa Melayu itu satu perjuangan kemerdekaan, lambang perpaduan kebangsaan. 22 Jun 1956, hasil daripada kesaktian lidah rakyat, kami lahir sebagai institusi keramat dengan nama Dewan Bahasa dan Pustaka. Angin semilir bertiup perlahan-lahan memupuk rasa cinta dan penghayatan. Kami percaya ubur perjuangan mendaulatkan bahasa kebangsaan perlu sentiasa disemarakkan nyalanya. Angin kencang itu kembali datang membawa suara bantahan, meluahkan rasa kekecewaan. Sesungguhnya, bahasa Melayu itu mesti dipertahankan. Angin timur dan barat membawa harumnya wangian bahasa Melayu ke seluruh tanah air tercinta, melahirkan ribuan cerdik pandai, merentasi pelbagai bidang ilmu, memperkaya khazanah kesusasteraan, mendepani segala perubahan zaman. Kami hadir dengan semangat dan harapan memandaikan generasi masa hadapan yang tetap bertunjangkan kebangsaan. Angin sendalu menderu lembut, lalu membiaskan kedinginan. Dalam dunia yang sentiasa mengejar kepesatan, kami akan memastikan bahasa Melayu tidak akan ketinggalan dengan penghasilan produk dan perkhidmatan yang akan memberikan nilai ekonomi. Angin pancaroba sering berubah-ubah tiupannya, membawa cabaran dan halangan. Kami tetap akan membakar semangat, memupuk rasa kebersamaan agar anda sentiasa berdiri bangga di mata dunia dengan identiti kebangsaan yang tidak pernah sesekali goyah. Kami sedar angin akan terus bertiup yang akan membuatkan anda berhadapan keraguan kesetiaan. Tetapi kami akan tetap berdiri teguh kerana kami satu-satunya petugas zaman yang akan tetap mempertahankan. Kerana kami Dewan Bahasa dan Pustaka lahir dari restu jiwa pahlawan, kami ucapkan dengan sepenuh keazaman, bahasa itu jiwa bangsa. Angin kencang itu menuntut satu kemahuan, menegaskan satu pendirian, bahawa bahasa Melayu itu satu perjuangan kemerdekaan, lambang perpaduan kebangsaan. 22 Jun 1956, hasil daripada kesaktian lidah rakyat, kami lahir sebagai institusi keramat dengan nama Dewan Bahasa dan Pustaka. Angin semilir bertiup perlahan-lahan memupuk rasa cinta dan penghayatan. Kami percaya ubur perjuangan mendaulatkan bahasa kebangsaan perlu sentiasa disemarakkan nyalanya. Angin kencang itu kembali datang membawa suara bantahan, meluahkan rasa kekecewaan. Sesungguhnya, bahasa Melayu itu mesti dipertahankan. Angin timur dan barat membawa harumnya wangian bahasa Melayu ke seluruh tanah air tercinta, melahirkan ribuan cerdik pandai, merentasi pelbagai bidang ilmu, memperkaya khazanah kesusasteraan, mendepani segala perubahan zaman. Kami hadir dengan semangat dan harapan memandaikan generasi masa hadapan yang tetap bertunjangkan kebangsaan. Angin sendalu menderu lembut, lalu membiaskan kedinginan. Dalam dunia yang sentiasa mengejar kepesatan, kami akan memastikan bahasa Melayu tidak akan ketinggalan dengan penghasilan produk dan perkhidmatan yang akan memberikan nilai ekonomi. Angin pancaroba sering berubah-ubah tiupannya, membawa cabaran dan halangan. Kami tetap akan membakar semangat, memupuk rasa kebersamaan agar anda sentiasa berdiri bangga di mata dunia dengan identiti kebangsaan yang tidak pernah sesekali goyah. Kami sedar angin akan terus bertiup yang akan membuatkan anda berhadapan keraguan kesetiaan. Tetapi kami akan tetap berdiri teguh kerana kami satu-satunya petugas zaman yang akan tetap mempertahankan, kerana kami Dewan Bahasa dan Pustaka lahir dari restu jiwa pahlawan. Kami ucapkan dengan sepenuh keazaman, bahasa itu jiwa bangsa. Angin kencang itu menuntut satu kemahuan, menegaskan satu pendirian, bahawa bahasa Melayu itu satu perjuangan kemerdekaan, lambang perpaduan kebangsaan. 22 Jun 1956, hasil daripada kesaktian lidah rakyat, kami lahir sebagai institusi keramat dengan nama Dewan Bahasa dan Pustaka. Angin semilir bertiup perlahan-lahan, memupuk rasa cinta dan penghayatan. Kami percaya obor perjuangan mendaulatkan bahasa kebangsaan perlu sentiasa disemarakkan nyalanya. Angin kencang itu kembali datang, membawa suara bantahan, meluahkan rasa kekecewaan. Sesungguhnya, bahasa Melayu itu mesti dipertahankan. Angin timur dan barat membawa harumnya wangian bahasa Melayu ke seluruh tanah air tercinta, melahirkan ribuan cerdik.
Panel of distinguished educators, ladies and gentlemen, Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh, and a very good day to all of you who are present today in this Royal Malaysian Intervarsity Debating Championship 2022. First of all, allow me to introduce myself. My name is Rashadwani Abdul Halim, and I will be the speaker for this round. Without further ado, let us begin our debate session now. I will start first by introducing all the debaters that will share out their arguments and suggestions for today's motion. Representing the government team, I would like to welcome Mr. Nurul Huda as the Prime Minister, Mr. Shahid Mohammad Tanzil Junaid as the Deputy Prime Minister, Yuganesh as the government whip, and the reply speech will be delivered by Yuganesh. And the reply speech will be delivered by Mr. Nurul Huda. Next, representing the opposition team, I would like to welcome Mr. Muhyiddin Asad as the Leader of Opposition, Mr. Kuhan Kartikal as the Deputy Leader of Opposition, and Ms. Catherine Alicia Nathan as the Opposition Whip, and the reply speech will be delivered by Kuhan Kartikal. Ladies and gentlemen, I will now introduce the distinguished educators for this round. Please welcome Ms. Hana Zawawi as the Chief Adjudicator, Mr. Rafiq Saladin as the Second Adjudicator, and Ms. Hilmi Yazid as the Third Adjudicator. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm pretty sure that all of you have understood the ground rules for every debate session. However, please allow me to humbly remind all of us of the rules and regulations that needs to be adhered to as follows. First, during the debate, please silence your mobile phone or any device that may produce disturbing sound. Second, for substantive speech session, the bell will ring once at the first and the 6th minute. At the 7th minute, the bell will ring twice. And for the reply speech session, the bell will ring once at the 3rd minute and twice at the 4th minute. Ladies and gentlemen, please be informed that the motion for today's debate is this House believes that IMF should provide an unconditional economic bailout to Sri Lanka. Okay. To open the debate, I would like to call upon the Prime Minister from the government team, Ms. Nurul Huda, to propose the motion. Please welcome.
Firstly, the state of civilians in Sri Lanka. Understand that currently these civilians are very vulnerable and live a very low quality of life. What do you mean when we say that, right? First is the fact that their basic necessities are hampered, the fact that food shortages and inflation and currency depreciation happen. That means that their day-to-day life in itself are very difficult. It's hard for them to sustain jobs, it's hard for them to get a shelter on their heads, it's hard for them to even have working electricity and have running water on their head, right? So we think that in itself should be taken into consideration. Secondly, is the state of politics in Sri Lanka. Currently, it looks like that they have no government or a very unstable constitution, right? And why is this problematic? Firstly, in forms of other nations or other organizations that may potentially step foot in the vulnerable state of Sri Lanka and use them to their personal benefit, right? So firstly, with that settled, government would like to clarify justification on what we mean by unconditional economic bailout, right? Firstly, what we think will happen is why it's necessary is when the economic bailout is conditional, more likely than not, it will de-incentivize the new government to take loan if it's conditional. We think that more likely than not, the alternative that would happen is the new government would opt into lucrative options provided by China or Japan, or two, if they don't intend to take any form of monetary aid, more likely than not, they will be taken over by militia groups, for example, the Tamil Tigers, right? And I'll prove to you later in my speech, integrated with my arguments, why that this is problematic. So with that being said, moving on to arguments. Firstly, understand that there is an economic incentive for Sri Lanka to be better from their current state, right? What do you mean by economic incentive? We think that by opting into the economic unconditional economic bailout, more likely than not, this will kickstart economic conditions that are in Sri Lanka. What we mean by that is that they have the the monetary power to buy resources in terms of food from neighboring countries. They have the power to have fuel and power generation across the country. They also will have subsidies to be given to firms to kickstart. Sorry, I'll take you later. To kickstart any forms of businesses within Sri Lanka. And what it looks like is that it will increase public spending to create more jobs and just have more stable Sri Lanka in the future, right? So what is the comparison that we tell you? The comparison is that if there is no economic incentive given to Sri Lanka in status quo right now, it will potentially lead to a civil war due to militia groups exerting their force in areas in that demographic, right? We see it happening with Taliban, so we think that it's not a far world where it may happen to Sri Lanka as well. So second argument is that it will improve Western relations. What we mean by that is that we think, sure, thank you.
Yeah, the Southeast Asian economy crashed in 1999. Where is this economic incentive that you talked about back then?
Okay, so on that point, incentive we mean is integrated within this current argument, is that the comparison is, I told you earlier before that more likely than not, that it's either IMF or China or militia groups, right? So we think within those three alternatives, the most that favors their own gain in the future is IMF, because we think one, a militia group is just least likely that we would like to take into, and two, we don't think that China is a better comparison. Why? Because we think that China more likely than not will take over Sri Lanka for their personal gain, considering the nature of China in itself. And in status quo itself, China already has existing political power over Sri Lanka, in which that they have control over the main port of China, right? Understand why this is bad. Firstly, it's the fact that China will wipe out the resources of Sri Lanka completely. It's not to the point that they will use the resources, they will expedite and completely wipe off the resources, not only for their personal gain, but also for exporting to other countries, so on and so forth, right? Two, why we think it's bad is that more likely than not, China will make Sri Lanka a China 2.0. What we mean by that is that they will instill a leader within their own beliefs that does not cater to Sri Lankan people at all, and it will just what Sri Lanka will be is just a political forum for to cater for China and have China gain more power within the world, right? Why do you think that's problematic? Is that within status quo in itself, China already has a soft power over a lot of nations, especially in Asian countries. So we don't think that it's good in itself to give China more power, more hard power, especially considering the fact that Sri Lanka is a very strategic geological location where it would only expedite China's existing power. Before I move on, yes.
Given the characterization, the info slide already says Sri Lankan government is embroiled with cronyism and nepotism. Why is it likely that they listen to the people if it's a corrupted context of the country?
Sorry, I'll just move on. Okay, so going back to my argument of improving Western relations, right? Why we think the trade-off of improving Western relations is beneficial for Sri Lanka in itself is because, one, we think that it's in their best interest to have better trade deals with Western relations in order to improve the ties that they need, and two, gain leverage by instilling whatever soft power that they can, and three, we think that is a better alternative than China, right? So in response to corruption within Sri Lanka, understand that within status quo itself, the people of Sri Lanka wanted to bring down the past corrupt leader in itself. So we think that Sri Lanka is moving towards a direction where the people on the ground, the civilians themselves, will not have people like that in power again, given that it already happens within status quo, right? So with that, what have I told you in my speech today is that one, it is justified to give Sri Lanka an unconditional loan as compared to a conditional loan because one, it helps the new government to step foot within with their self and not de-incentivize them further from taking the loan, and two, it gives them an alternative from being a pawn to China and taking in the lucrative options that most likely than not China will offer. And three, it will potentially stop any form of militia group from taking over and further harassing the civilians on ground. Two, we told you two arguments. One is the economic incentive that Sri Lanka will gain and how that would further improve Western relations with for Sri Lanka's own benefit. So for all of those reasons, Simon Buff, thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Prime Minister. Up next, I would like to invite the Leader of the Opposition, Mr. Muhyiddin Hasan, to present the arguments. Please welcome.
If you want to ask you, I can just raise your hand. I'll take you by 7 minutes, which is right. Yeah. Okay. I'll take you by 5.5 from T1 to 5. 3, 2, 1. Panel, I think it was quite convenient for side government to leave out the part that the government in question here is one that employs cronyism, is one that is corrupt, is one that has never shown a care for the citizens that they claim are suffering because of what the government did in the first place we think that it's unlikely they get any of the outcomes they wanted to argue towards coming from side government. A few things I'm going to be doing in my speech. Firstly, a couple of response onto this brief framing, because I don't think they talked about the bigger picture when we talk about Sri Lanka. Ultimately, onto two arguments in my speech. Let's talk about responses first. Firstly, wrong case coming from side government. I'm sorry to say, your job is not to defend like why we're not going to align with China and why Japan is bad and things like that. Your job is to argue why there shouldn't be conditions on why there shouldn't be conditions on this loan. It is not IMF on our side versus versus whatever on your side, but it's a comparative on whether or not there should be conditions. Secondly, you talked about trade deals, like why we need trade deals with Western relations and you get that faster. Firstly, I would just like to reiterate that there is no mechanization as how you get to the outcome in the first place, but even assuming you wanted to say that this is a benefit that we should have, I would argue that you're more likely to strengthen these trade relations with Western countries when you allow the restructuring of your debt to take place, when you allow things like trade liberalization and like globalization of trade to take place. I think it's more likely that Western liberal democracies are more likely to trade with you in that instance. But the third response that I want to read, that I want to post here, is the fact that the assumption of our case is that if you don't have these conditions, if you have these conditions, Sri Lanka won't take this debt. But IMF already came in September and agreed to this particular bailout, right? So therefore, I don't think that the counterfactual is that Sri Lanka is not going to take this bailout on your side. Therefore, Judge, I think the framing is pretty simple. When you talk about Sri Lanka, the outcome or the current status quo that we look at right now is directly the impact of poor political management. They wanted an organic agricultural system or agricultural industry. They wanted to phase out GMO products, and what they did was they increased tax on farmers and they screwed over their economy, right? And also, secondly, I want to note, they talked about economic incentive. Now we will have the economic incentive change. Now we'll do all these great things. I would say that's unlikely, because you had so much of time. You had 50 to 60 years for a country to develop other forms of their infrastructure. Sri Lanka solely relies on the agricultural industry, and this has come to bite them in the back. But thirdly, there's been no change, no elections thus far. If you claim that the situation that the people in the country are living in is bad and the people are suffering, then why hasn't there been elections to change the leaders at the top? Because these very leaders who are corrupted, who have screwed over your people, are the same people who are going to take these conditionless bailouts, and you are claiming that they're going to use it for the greater good. I think not. Onto my argument then, why unconditional bailouts is principally unjustified. Firstly, there's zero precedence, guys. Literally, there has been no event of a crisis where bailouts or any form of loans have been given on the basis of no conditions. Because the reason why these countries are in these positions in the first place is because of a very fundamental structural flaw within their management system, within their operations, within how they handle their economy. We see this with Sri Lanka, we see this with every other crisis. Conditions make things better, right? But what do these conditions look like? I think I already told you. When you talk about trade liberalization, right? When we take away protectionist policies and things like that, that increases confidence for Western democracies to come in. I would argue that's the impact that's good for both sides, right? But let's talk about secondly, why the IMF is not just a private billionaire that's meant to fund other countries. I think if you are an independent entity like the IMF with like partners and you work with different countries, the principle that you're operating on is utilitarianism. You cannot just prioritize one country in this particular instance, which is Sri Lanka, and tell them, hey, it's okay, if you screw us over and you don't pay us back our debts and things like that, you are suffering, we should only care about you. In this particular instance, especially when we have seen so many countries suffer from COVID, so many countries having economic shocks, other countries that are third world and developing that are suffering, I would argue that the IMF does not have the capacity to fund you in a way that is conditionless. But secondly, why is there a right for the IMF to do this in the first place? I think firstly that the conditions don't impede on your sovereignty. If they wanted to claim that we have China on our side, which I think is highly unlikely, because the reason why that's unlikely is because it's not the Belt and Road Initiative, right? It's not China coming in and telling you, hey, we need all these things from you, but we also need your sovereignty from you. The fact that IMF can also give loans and bailouts to countries like South Africa, even when it's a morally ambiguous character, they still employ methods that fight for the best economic changes and places conditions on that regard instead of conditions on regards of how a country should change to be better. But secondly, just the IMF has better experts. Like I would argue the fact that Sri Lanka got in this position in the first place is because they didn't have like expert advice, or their government is just a joke to begin with. I would argue you get better advice, you get better form of policy making on the part of the economy. That's why it's principally unjustified for employing any conditionalists. But secondly, let's talk about why conditional bailouts are geared to solve immediate effects of the country. Why won't Sri Lanka use this country, or use this money in this particular way? That is good. I think I'll bring back all the framing that I talked to you about earlier, when we talked about how Sri Lanka has an extremely state-controlled media, extremely state-controlled form of jurisdiction, right? That they have large inequality gaps that have lasted throughout years in history, decades and decades upon decades of unequalness and injustice within the country, right? But even if they claim that, oh, this is when they will change, right? But you have already had various shocks throughout your history. We saw the economy crash in 1999, right? If there was an incentive to change, if there was an incentive to develop other industries or like suddenly be a better economic actor, that incentive should have existed way back then. But things still haven't changed. I'll take a POI before 6. No POS. Okay, the comparative then is simple, Judge. In their world, they are free to use this money however they want it. Given that firstly, there's no mechanization coming from the side of government as to why they'll use this money in a way that's beneficial, I think they already lose out a lot of their impacts. But secondly, in our world is when you're forcing a country that's corrupt to make better economic decisions. Because you're relying on a character that's morally not just ambiguous, but morally wrong and morally abhorrent to make all these right decisions that we talked about. I would argue that conditions force these actors into a corner where they have no choice but to fix things in their country. The best case that you get on the side of government is them re-energizing their agricultural industry, which is something that Sri Lanka wants to do, given that that's the part of their economy that has failed them. Even in this particular instance, I would argue that that's not the best case or the best thing for Sri Lanka to do, given that it's a failed industry with it's time that we invest into other industries like technology. But secondly, in terms of public pressure, even if you want to argue that public pressure works in your instance, I would claim that in an economic crisis, what people would want is things like stimulus checks, things like immediate welfare. I would argue that all these instances don't necessarily bring up the most long-term form of benefit it can for the economy. Therefore, people will struggle even more in the long term, even though they have some form of recuperation in the short term. I would argue that not just the short term sucks in their world, the long term is a disaster. Never been prouder to propose.
Mr. Shahid Mohamad Hazim Judai to consider the motion. Please welcome.
It's okay if I speak.
Yeah.
Okay, starting in 3. I'll go over a few responses to side the opposition before we go to really my substantive and understanding point. So side opposition tried to come up with and tell you that when you have these conditions, they'll instantly take the bill with these conditions and they'll change this whole thing. However, they don't see, they don't understand that when the point in time there are conditions attached to these bailouts, it already disincentivizes this government from taking in these bailouts because they don't want to lose control over their dictatorship or lose control over their power. The point in time you have these conditions, it jeopardizes their position in the leadership positions because more likely than not, they'll more liberalization, trade liberalization, stopping the other conditions that they talked about. They're also likely to be attached with democracy as it is with more, make the country more democratic as it is with almost all other IMF bailouts that they give in order to gain soft power over these countries. Understand that point in time these conditions are provided this government, it disincentivizes this government from taking the loan because they have better alternatives in China who will likely back them and make them a power, and they are likely to stay in power when they are backed by China. Thus, they're more likely to sway over towards China or other entities because they are likely to keep their power under their side instead of jeopardizing that power. But understand that the idea that their benefits does not work, that they'll get all these benefits instantly and that the short term is better and long term is better, it does not work because this government is not likely to take in their field because they don't see the incentive ahead, especially when there are other people providing these loans which would more likely back them. So the second thing that we have to understand is that the people that are likely to suffer, I'll take you later, the people that are likely to suffer this journalism, they're the ones that are suffering from food shortages and whatnot. Understand that Sri Lankan government, they ran over the Sri Lankan president's palace a few months ago and he's in hiding right now. So understands that even if he wants to stay in power, he does have some incentive to gain some favor with the people. And that is why we believe, in order to stabilize the situation and stay in power, he can't completely have all the people against him and hope to stay in power. That's why we believe the money that they will gain from this conditionless bailout will work. Why is it? Firstly, it's more incentivizing for them to take this conditionless bailout because there are no conditions and it doesn't jeopardize their power, and they're more likely to be more free as to how they use the money. Secondly, they want to, I'll take it later. Secondly, they do have incentive to gain favor back with the people because you can't completely antagonize the people and stay in power. So they will likely use the, even if it's not completely monitored, even if it's not completely stationed as if it would be with conditions, at least this money is going to the people in some forms that would give them benefits. It might be looking like getting oil to power up their fuel stations, getting the electricity back, even if getting fiscal stimulus to the people, businesses to start up businesses, create more jobs, increase public spending and public sector such as health and whatnot. Just create more jobs and get these people back on their feet to some extent. Why is there? This would likely benefit the people in the short term because they're likely to get more faith in their government, and that also the government has incentive to take this money and spend it on the people in order to gain back that faith. So we believe that the conditionless works because one, they're more likely to take the bailout from the IMF, and that means that they're likely to gain more. I'll take it later. They're likely to get the movement that we have. On their side, the improvements do not happen because they have alternatives and they won't likely take it. Secondly, let's talk about why. Before I go on.
On one hand, you have China telling it's okay if you can't pay, we'll just take one of your ports. On the other hand, you have the IMF saying it's okay if you can't pay, we'll restructure things like your debt repayment. You are saying that the former is better.
I'm not saying the former is better. I'm telling you that the dictator won't take where they're going to restructure the economy while one backs their power without any conditions, because they have more incentive to take one that does not jeopardize their power or their position. That's why we believe that they'll take the loan from IMF if it's conditionless, because it allows them more freedom to be with how they spend their money. Secondly, how is this better in the long term? Understand that while we have when they take this loan from IMF, it improves their relationship with the West, and it means that they have some form of power over it, some forms of power or a better relationship with the Sri Lankan government. And in the future, it's not like this one loan is going to completely fix Sri Lanka or whatnot. In the future, even if there are situations, they are likely come out for more loans. Understand that when you already have better favor with them, they're likely to take in smaller steps or smaller changes that are likely to better off their economy. So that means that in the future term, you have more chances to have more conditions because they have a better trade relationship. But understand that when you're trying to completely have these conditions forced upon you in the first place, they're unlikely to take it because they don't want to change right now. They will likely take, once they gain the favor of the people, they have more incentive to at least keep on improving and improve their own resources in this thing. So why is it also problematic that if the people don't get the money right now? Why is it the problem with conditions? One is because having these conditions means there is the time span where they'll need to negotiate. Why is this problematic? Understand the moment in time there's a time span. These people are suffering. They're likely to be starving. They're likely to be fighting, and there's likely to be civil unrest. What this means is that there are other, like the Tamil Tigers, there were other terrorist organizations that were previously present in Sri Lanka, and they're likely to take advantage of the situation and cause more civil unrest because they have the because they have the support of the people as to someone that can overthrow the government and take more power and maybe be more responsible. That's why they have more incentive to grow out in this kind of people, recruit more people, and cause civil unrest. The bottom line is, the point in time there is conditions, there is a negotiating time where you have to negotiate with the government, and that means this aid is not going to go to these people in right away. And in this time, there will be people suffering from food shortages, lack of resources and whatnot, and also because of the civil unrest created by the militia factions that might go out, there will likely be more casualties under their side of the house. So under our side, when the point in time where we instantly give this money, we do show you that the Rajapaksa has more incentive to take this loan when it's conditionless. Secondly, we tell you there's incentive to spend this money on the people now because he does still need some support of the people in order to stay in power. And thus, I believe that
Next, I would like to invite the Deputy Leader of Opposition, Mr. Kohar Khatib, to present the arguments.
In order for us to fix a corrupted country that doesn't listen to its people, that puts pockets of cash towards the politicians that have a symmetry of power with the citizens, the solution isn't just giving a stream of cash with absolutely no conditions, because what likely reaction that will result from it is the money will go back to the politicians, entrenching on their own ideals, further causing more money towards agricultural industries instead of diversifying the economy that actually listens to the people. The mistake that proposition makes in this debate is that they don't explain how their counterfactual is better at a point which is money can meaningfully be channeled back towards the most vulnerable, meaningfully channeled back towards restructuring the economy in a way that benefits their country. Which is why in opposition, we feel unaccountably giving money is oftentimes a recipe for disaster, especially when the context of a country is something corrupted. There needs to be more strategic way of facilitating that conflict, facilitating this issue in a way that IMF can do it best. 3 questions we're going to answer in this speech, all responses will be integrated. Firstly, is Sri Lanka more likely to take the unconditional loan? The first thing I want to point out here, Judge, is this is not part of the debate. I don't know why proposition is spending an exorbitant amount of time explaining to us that in their world, they're more likely to take the loan. Sure, you're corrupt, you're definitely going to take the loan, but the debate is about whether conditions are better into dealing with the problem or the lack of conditions. So proposition had to defend the case as to why an unconditional loan is far better versus a world where we have conditional loans from the IMF. I don't know why the whole counterfactual of militia group coming and causing civil unrest is a reasonable counterfactual in this debate, when the whole entirety of the motion is discussing whether or not conditions of the loan to begin with or something that is good. But secondarily, even if that was the case, we will give you 3 reasons why Sri Lankan government will still take the loan in our world. Firstly, they're incredibly poor. Secondly, they have a sustainable stream pool of cash with IMF that is an international accredited actor, and it's also a US proxy to begin with. And thirdly, they already had a deal with IMF. In 1st of September, recently, they already had a deal with IMF to proceed with the fact that you're going to get a stream of cash and loan to begin with. So I don't understand the starting point of proposition's case to suggest exactly why there will be 0 loans under their world and they will just resort towards taking money from the militia in the first place, and that will cause so much of civil unrest, but that wasn't the debate in the first place. But even if that was the debate, Judge, 2 things to point out from proposition's case that was incredibly detrimental towards their case. Firstly, they don't deal with our mechanism as to how conditions actually fix the broken systems within a country, how it revitalizes the economy, how debt repayment means that we're not giving money back towards the corrupt leaders that actually entrench their own political ideas, how exactly we reshift the economy into giving more jobs towards the poor and listening to the people. This part of the case was significantly cropped out of proposition, they're not dealing with that. But second thing that they have to deal with is all their benefits on listening to people, on increasing public expenditure is something they have to question as to why corruption won't get in that way. Corruption is a significant challenge of actually making sure you increase public spending, and if you already characterize the context of Sri Lanka being corrupted, I'm unclear why the benefit is something that materialized. The conclusion to this first question is, the entire case was on a wrong footing. We think the debate should have been about whether it's better, moral good for everyone, for IMF, for Sri Lanka, for the people, if we were to have conditions or not the former that proposition is talking about. Second question, how this strategically addresses the corrupted political climate in favor of economic reform. Here's where the solvency comes, panel. Because I think proposition does very little job into telling you how is this likely. They do explain a laundry list of public expenditure, giving more money to the poor, but the mechanics of reaching that goal is something they do not question or do not explain. How do we do this in our world? Firstly, in terms of economy, when we're deregulating the economy, when we're delaying debt repayment, that's when we're allowing individuals to not pay money towards the corrupted leaders that are entrenched on their political ideas. This is important because we think the problem is corrupted leaders that are in power due to nepotism and cronyism. They're always entrenched in their political ideal and their self-interest. In a world in which IMF steps in as a condition, that's when we're deregulating these industries from the corrupt political leaders that have autonomy over this region. But secondly, why are we better for the poor? When we have increasing of taxes, we need to know that Sri Lanka is an incredibly exporting country, and what this means is that we're increasing tariffs on the export that we can make. We have more remittance back and more pool of cash that the governments can get. What this translates into better purchasing power that can result towards people, and oftentimes also means that we can open up jobs because we're revitalizing the economy and opening up ourselves to more trade. This is a sustainable roadmap that can actually help the poor and also help shift the economic status of the country because it's already incredibly corrupt. Thirdly, we have a more sustainable roadmap as well. Because one of the conditions of IMF is to have a stable government, what this means is that it's probably we're going to incentivize to have, we force you to have elections, for instance. We force you to deregulate state media that feeds into propaganda. What this means is that we're giving back the autonomy to the people to actually choose leaders that they want. We're also reshaping the economy in a way that actually is not so corrupt, that push for better economic growth, and that's a sustainable roadmap in our world. What happens in propositions world that we need to address, problems that we need to address that prevents them from getting their benefit? Number one, Sri Lanka is an incredibly saturated economy. What this means is that they pump so much money towards agriculture instead of actually diversifying the economy to a multifaceted industries. What this means is that it is incredibly volatile. At any point of crisis, the whole economy can crash. We need to shift the economy to become more diverse and open up to trade. That's what we do on opposition's world. Secondly, they don't deal with the asymmetry of power that politicians have with individuals. This is not just a classic Tadika argument, asymmetry of power. This is more nuanced towards Sri Lanka because cabinet ministers in Sri Lanka don't have to disclose their salary. They don't have to pay taxes as well. What this means is that because the entrenchment of the symmetry of power is so large and nepotism and cronyism is so large, I'm questioning them how do they reach the benefits of listening to the poor unless there's an intervention of IMF to make sure we will give you regular intervals of paying money if you meet up with our conditions. That to the very least, at least some level of mechanism to making sure they meet the requirements and get the benefit. Final argument, how is this, where is China? How is this more incentivized towards reducing the hostility and power of China? Okay, it's here. The previous to this argument is, it is true, China is a horrible actor, but why would China be more exploitative in their world? We need to know two important contexts in order for this argument to operate. The first important context is, China is already in PR, right? They already prey on developing countries and vulnerable countries. Oftentimes they take away airports, shipping ports at a point in which you renegade on deals. Number two, specifically in Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka already had its ports taken by China because they already renegated on deals. Three problems will happen in propositions world. It's likely that China will have a hostile takeover of the exports and imports. It's already happening. All the remittance will go back to China. They won't have control over exports and imports anymore, and they won't have control over the agriculture industry that is so important. At least in our world, IMF can step in their Western proxy. China is a bit scared. At least they're an international actor that's back and moderating it. And it's not bilateral in nature because IMF, it's not China and Sri Lanka alone. Further exploitation, further choco and dial for all this reason, it's incredibly powerful.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Leader of Opposition. Moving on, I would like to applaud the government whip. Mr. Yugenesh to continue proposing the motion on behalf of the government whip. Please welcome.
I'll take the motion from the second to fifth minute. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. I realize that both sides are actually trying to fight for the greater good for the Sri Lankan government, right? And we're trying to see that why we need the IMF to be unconditional and why we seek that supports the side government, right? We've tried to prove to you time and time again that unconditionally giving out the economic bailout to Sri Lanka is going to incentivize a new government to take loans, right? And it's going to make them more easier to be able to take this loan. And even if it is being run by the older government, meaning even if Rajapaksa is still the prime minister for this governmental body for Sri Lanka, right? There is more incentivizing for him to be able to use these loans for the greater good because he could not be able to make the same mistakes twice again. Even if he is to be able to use nepotism by using these loans for his own favor, I think it will not be able to work because Sri Lanka has already seen from time in and time out what is the negative imposes that this person can bring forth, right? So Rajapaksa has two decisions. One is just to go missing in action and just disappear from like this whole governmental body and just to give it over to a newer government who have better chances of being to lead the Sri Lanka, or to make ties with what he has done and given him a second chance to be able to repopulate back and re-benefit back the Sri Lankan population to be able to make sure that they are more stable than what they are right now. We both side government and our opposition are actually agreeing with the fact that we do not want China to come in, right? We do not want another third party organization to be able to come over and to monopolize over Sri Lanka, and that's why we believe that the IMF should be giving a should
should be giving funds, right? So the main clash is, right, for us to say that why do we need the IMF's funds to be unconditional, right? Why we need IMF to be unconditional is because even if it is incentivizing the old government, we truly believe that in the old government's point of view, for them to be overturned by the civilians of Sri Lanka, for them to see that the mass poverty that is being happening and the economical crisis that is going on in Sri Lanka, it is only fair for them to be able to put the civilians before themselves. And even if they are going to be in a corrupt sort of situation, it is not going to work in their favor because it will not. Sorry. And even if it's like a new government coming over, and even if it's like a new governmental body coming to govern Sri Lanka from the ground up, they still do not have this sort of an economical build-up to be able to do so. And that's why we believe that IMF should be giving them fund. Before I move on, yes.
The problem with your China comparative is you don't explain the psychological rationale of the government to take China who literally rob their ports when they renegade on payments versus IMF who is just coming to restructure and help you with your economy. What is the psyche of the government to make that decision?
The psyche of the government is that we believe that if IMF were to give like these loans with conditions and the mechanisms that you guys were saying about like a stable government and forcing them to have elections, it's more likely or not to be able to be accepted by Sri Lanka because you guys have also agreed that Sri Lanka is having a very corrupt government, right? So there's no that technically they will be better off taking loans from this China because China is more likely to be supporting Rajapaksa in the means of it because China has other means. Not just talking about China, Japan, and like any other like people who want to take advantage of China, right? So IMF does not have that ill intention behind it because IMF does not technically get anything from being able to fight them because they're not going to be able to like cover up the country and say like you're mine or something like that. In the other sense, it's actually going to have good ties with Sri Lanka so that when in the near future when Sri Lanka is able to be more financially stable, that will make good ties with IMF and Sri Lanka instead of having Sri Lanka be bankrupt and technically just become China 2.0, right? So that's that. So the other thing that was a clash is that we talking about the conditions and the mechanisms that was brought forward by side opposition if IMF was to give the funds, right? Another thing that they always say is that the mechanism is going to be for a stable government. They, time in and time out, are realizing that the politicians in Sri Lanka are corrupt. They keep calling Sri Lanka a corrupt country, it's a corrupt country. It's not a corrupt country. They just had a prime minister who was corrupt and he was monetizing over it. And they are now given in a point that they cannot fight themselves. That's why we brought in the examples of militia and Tamil Tigers and stuff like that because these are minority group of people who were oppressed and thought that they should fight back. And now the whole country, the whole civilization, whole civilians in Sri Lanka, right, who are not part of like the governing body, are technically not considered a minority because their voices are not being heard, they are not being fed off, and they are not giving, they are not being given like just natural resources like electricity and even food and stuff like that, right? So these people overthrowing the government is not something that is like impossible to figure out. So now it is up to the government to decide whether or not they can just monetize out of whatever is going on right now and then just be able to, I guess, fly out to Mars and be better off without it, or to know that they've made a mistake and for them to overthrow, to redesign back this governing body to make sure that Sri Lanka is going to go back to the stable sort of a financial place that it was in like back in the days, right, before Rajapaksa's election and whatnot, right? And another thing that we brought forth about the idea of having it to be unconditional is that it's going to solve two things. First of all, it's going to make it such that they are able to get the resources to be able to kickstart their economies and stuff like that, right? And we also see that it is very much more easier for them to be able to take something that is unconditional because they are not in any given point to be able to follow the condition. And just because that IMF is going to improve the condition, and just because opposition is saying that these mechanisms are going to be catered towards them, it is more likely than not that Sri Lanka will not be able to follow this mechanism. So thus, said fund will not be given to Sri Lanka, right? Because they will not be able to follow the conditions and the mechanisms that is being brought for the IMF. And that is why we believe that it has to be unconditional to make it such that these people will be given a fighting chance. Because if we are going to leave Sri Lanka to be in the state of poverty that they are right now, nothing is going to change. We understand that they've had mistakes in the past, that they've had corrupt governing bodies and stuff like that. But giving them a second chance is not just going to make it such that they will be reliving back to the roots and they're just going to make history repeat itself, right? Because that is what side government is assuming Sri Lanka is going to do at that point, right? So before I end my debate, what we want from side government is for Sri Lanka to have the stable governing bodies to be able to go back to a more a stable economic and like political place in the land. At minimum, to be able to buy enough resources for them to kickstart back all the functions and the institutions since the economic crisis that they have and be able to like overcome that. Right? And the other thing is to not be exploited by bigger countries and like bigger governing bodies that are not the IMF, in example like China and Japan, and thus proving to be a more bigger of an impact in the long term, because technically what you're doing by giving like said resources and giving off like a such strategic geological position like Sri Lanka over to China and etc. Right, is going to bring on long-term effects not only to Sri Lanka but to globally. And I really believe that IMF should realize it and thus make their funds unconditional for Sri Lanka. So they said prior to propose.
Hi, could I just ask someone to tell people who are coming in and out to only come in and out in between speeches and not in the middle of one speaking? Very simple.
Thank you, Mr. Government Whip. Moving on, I would like to invite the Opposition Whip, Ms. Catherine Alicia to present your arguments. Most welcome.
Thank you.
Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Judge, I'm going to make the clashes in this debate extremely simple so that I think there's a very clear argument to be made. 3 parts to my speech. First, a very short discussion of the principle, which at this point has been completely unresponded to. Second, on whether Sri Lanka will take the loan from IMF or not. And thirdly, on which side improves the Sri Lankan economy, which I think has been the biggest contention on side government. First, on the principle, we gave you 2 parts to our principle. I think Assam did a pretty good job with this, right? First, they told you that there's no precedence in which IMF has given a loan that's essentially a bailout with 0 conditions, right? They had to do the legwork to prove why this is able to bring precedent or important enough to ensure that IMF is able to bring that. But also, secondly, we've given you the principle as to how you are rewarding essentially the bad actors that has put Sri Lanka down this downward spiral, right? You're essentially giving money without conditions to the individuals that has caused suffering for people in Sri Lanka. It is principally morally unjust. No explanation on their side as to why this is true. We take the principle of action. Second part of my speech, will they take the loan or not? At first panel, I really don't know why this is contention. I think this debate kind of assumes that on both sides the loan will be taken. It's just a comparative as to whether Sri Lanka will be better off with a loan with conditions or without conditions. I think what speakers have done a good job in explaining that. But I'll just engage with their fantasy, right? They tell you that they will not, that the loan will not be taken on our side of the house because you jeopardize the power of these individuals that are corrupt. I'm going to flip this and tell you that it's more likely than not that these corrupt politicians will see their powers or authority expanding if you take a loan with conditions from the IMF. Because see, firstly, if you see a facade that you're making some change in this economy, at least you're doing well, I think this is very important to corrupt or these authoritarian leaders that need to feel like they're doing something, especially to individuals that are calling for your head, especially for individuals that are burning down your house, right? But second response, this is just factually untrue. In early September this year, they've already agreed to initial changes, and they've already put an amount on the table with some conditions that is to be in place for Sri Lanka. I don't know where a government gets this information from. But even if you don't buy this factual contention, right? I'll give you 3 logical reasons as to why Sri Lanka is likely to accept this loan. Firstly, Sri Lanka is poor. Money is still money regardless. I think it's quite likely that Sri Lanka would like to take that loan. But secondly, you get expert advice from the IMF. This is an exclusive benefit on our side of the house. I think this is one that's much needed, especially from corrupt authoritarian leaders that need to have some people backing their power. But thirdly, I think the IMF has a lot of success stories that Sri Lanka would like to engage in as well. Countries like South Africa have seen some level of success, some level of economic revitalization from taking IMF loans. All of this came with conditions. All of this just proves that this is some incentive for Sri Lanka to take this loan in the first place. But let's look at their side, right? Their whole contention or responses to our side of the house only deals with the fact that we don't take that loan. I think we've breaking that significantly, but they had to do the legwork to prove as to why, even if we are able to take that loan, why is that a better comparative? That's just basic debating. They did not do that in this debate. This debate was supposed to be conditions versus no conditions. They did that. They lose out in this clash. But let's now deal more with their clash, right? Which side improves the Sri Lankan economy. I want to first deal with their counterfactuals, which on the offset panel is ones that are extremely ridiculous, right? The first is on China and Japan, where they give you a full argument of why China is bad and why they are likely to move to these actors instead of taking loans with conditions from the IMF. I think firstly, there's no delta in their speech, right? Because China and Japan are already borrowers to Sri Lanka. China has already taken some pause. I don't know why this change is one that's significant. They don't prove that as well. But as a second, I think it's extremely unlikely, right? Because China has already screwed over the Sri Lankan economy. A lot of people within the Sri Lankan like citizens already disagree with the fact that China is taking away their sovereignty. I think that's an important point of contention for Sri Lankan people. But I think the leaders themselves see that they're losing power from taking loans from China. I think it's unlikely that these individuals would go against their self-preservation and take loans from China. There's no explanation inside government as to why they're likely to mitigate this, right? So even then, I don't know why this counterfactual is like one that is likely to result to manifest, or it's one that's going to result in law change. Let's look at the second counterfactual, militia takeover. I think we're already kind of dealing with this in Sri Lanka. There's already a large amount of civil unrest, but it's also, that means it's already likely on their side of the house as well. Even if you take a loan without conditions, I don't know why a large amount of money is going to prevent a militia takeover, especially if their characterization is that the militia wants power. I think it's more likely on their side. If your power comes in the form of money with no conditions, it's more likely to happen on their side. So all their counterfactuals just don't make sense in this debate. Let's look at the real counterfactual. They give you a laundry list of benefits that are supposed to happen if you are taking loans, taking a loan without conditions from IMF, right? I think it sounds nice, but there's only one mechanism that they prove in this debate as to why it's going to result, right? Which is that you have to gain favor from people. A few responses to this. Firstly, I think this is only for democracies. Democracies need that facade or need to gain favor from people because there needs to be some person to vote for in elections, right? They don't prove why this is likely for Sri Lanka. But also secondly, I think there's no mechanism within Sri Lanka itself to have that, right? People are already extremely pissed off at the Prime Minister. People want to kill the Prime Minister. People are burning down houses. They are taking to the streets and protesting. I don't know how there is that point of change in which you're able to gain favor when they already seem to be past the point of no return. But this is the best case. I think it's likely to be stimulus checks, right? If your mechanism is gaining favor from people, you want the most direct form of cash to these individuals. I think it's going to result in that very short-term change, no long-term change. You want to go?
Why is it suddenly with conditions that your government is more uncomfortable considering that you time and time again said that they are proud?
Well, Kuka and Assad already gave you so many reasons as to why that's true. I'll bring it up with you. Right. Let's look at the best case, stimulus checks. I think that's likely to be very short-term change. I don't think it results in anything that's beneficial to the Sri Lankan people. Even if it is able to prop up the businesses and the economy of Sri Lanka, I think this happens in a very short period of time. You have very little accountability measures to ensure any long-term change takes place. Let's look at the comparative, and this is where I'll answer your Q1. Our Inside provides you a very strong incentive to ensure that there's some level of trade liberalization, because if you don't keep up with the mechanisms or the conditions of the IMF, you literally don't get the money, right? So this results in them bringing in Western liberal democracies, their foreign investors, to ensure that you're able to have some change in the economy, some diversification in the economy that ensures that you're able to at least move away from your reliance on the agriculture industry. This ensures some level of, improving your balance of trade, or improving your balance of accounts, right? That ensures that your country has less debt, at least more money flowing in. This all results in better economic change. The last thing I want to note is that no response to our political argument as to how you're able to get more accountability in the government when you at least liberalize the economy and reduce the power of authoritarian states. Very proud.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Opposition, for your speech. To proceed with the next agenda, we will now continue our debate session for this round with the reply speech session. The reply speech shall be delivered first by the opposition leader. Therefore, without further ado, I would like to invite Mr. Rahman Kapukan to deliver his speech and conclude the debate. Please welcome.
Ladies and gentlemen, this reply speech is going to be really simple. I'm going to point out two technical flaws of team proposition that already makes them lose this debate, but I'll hammer it home in three other questions and explain why in this clash point we also take the debate as well. First, on technical flaws. The first technical flaw of team proposition was they didn't debate in the spirit of the motion. Notice how a large crux of their case was proving on livelihood. They said if they're able to show Sri Lankan government is more likely to take this deal, they already take this debate. But how is that fair? It's a corrupt nation that presented with the option of a loan with no conditions, of course they will take it. If they do take it, they don't win the debate either, because they're not debating the actual spirit of the motion, which is contrasting whether or not it's actually good for Sri Lanka if we were to have conditions or not. That was the starting point of the debate. They shifted it away by having this whole Malaysia case, but they didn't bring it home either. Even if this debate was true, and the debate was about likelihood, we will tell you, because it's not an active debate, and we talked about how this is good for Sri Lanka, good for IMF, and good for people in Sri Lanka, I would argue that already weighs out over the mechanism, even if the debate was about likelihood. I'll explain why we reached those goals much clearly in the 3 questions. But second technical flaw of team proposition is that they assumed sovereignty is the end-all be-all. 3 responses to this. Firstly, they did not deal with our argument on how there's no precedence for IMF to not have conditions. We have to note that there's so many conditions and crises that happened since the dawn of time. Even the 2008 financial crisis also had conditions by the IMF. Even in desperate situations of countries like Argentina, South Africa and Brazil, there were still conditions by IMF, which is trade liberalization. We had to hear what the exception was in these circumstances, but we didn't. Secondly, international relations always warrant some level of intervention of foreign entity. FDI, businesses, any form of environment summit also to some extent goes against sovereignty. I don't know why there's a silver bullet in their side, because sovereignty is not so, it's a grey area at this point. But thirdly, they don't prove the urgency either, and I don't see why this is something that's important to take out of sovereignty. These are 2 technical flaws of team proposition's case that already very restricted on the clashes of this debate and restricted on the mechanism of solvency in this debate as well. But 3 other questions as to why we take it and hammer it home. Firstly, on the principal part of this debate, what did opposition provide to you? 3 qualifiers. First, there is no precedence. We are not saying that just because there's no precedence, it means we can never have conditions or no conditions in the future. We are saying that because there's no precedence for multifaceted and big crises in the past, why is this an exception? And we didn't hear any analysis why this is an exception, and I think that's probably fair, Judge. Secondly, we explain why IMF is answerable towards the global market. They're not a private contractor to only deal with you. They're answerable and giving money responsible towards bailing out the vast majority of nations out there. They have to explain why it is likely for IMF to be crippled or not get any form of money back through their structuring of no conditions, and that hampers their ability to pay other countries that are more urgent. At least our side is dealing with the utilitarian principle of IMF. But thirdly, we explain that the context of an unregulated and corrupt country, giving money that's unconditional only feeds the money of the most corrupt politicians. We're restructuring the channel at a point in which we have some level of interventions and conditions they have to meet up. This is the principal part of the debate. They have absolutely no interaction here. Secondly, why is this good for Sri Lanka and its people? Again, 2 qualifiers. We explain that it's better for an economy for 3 key aspects. Number 1, we're deregulating industries. We're not giving money to the corrupt politicians that otherwise would have happened. Secondly, we're revitalizing trade and opening up the market to more jobs towards the poor. And number 3, we're increasing tariffs on export goods, which will have more money as the government to give back money towards the people as well. The response we hear is, how can we make sure Sri Lanka is not corrupt in our world? Because there are conditions. The fact that they have to make and meet up to these conditions in order to get a pool of money later on, because the money comes at different regular intervals, and that's enough accountability measures for us to actually have. But secondly, the political climate is far better in our world. We're giving back the power to the people to actually force things like elections, force things like deregulating state media. And finally, we explain why it's more hostile in their world, because the comparatively they have China that exploits them further. For all these reasons, I think it's clear on.
Thank you to the representative from the opposition team for the reply speech. And now I would like to invite Mr. Ruda from the government team to proceed with the reply speech and conclusion views.
My reply speech will be very simple. Well, I'll be addressing the four main intentions of this debate. Right? Firstly, I think it's very convenient for Site Op to place an impossibly large burden on us to tell us why, the debate is about conditions versus no conditions, and they tell you that the clash of likeliness is not something that is reasonable, right? We think that it's conventionally sugar spice and everything nice on their side, because obviously it goes without reason that conditions are better and there should be conditions, right? So we think that that is not a burden that should happen on Site Gov at the very first place. So we think that the clash of likeliness, whether or not Sri Lanka is to take the loan, is one that is reasonable on our side, right? So secondly, is about the characterization of the Sri Lankan government. And Yusuf was talking about how accountability is something that should be addressed on both sides, right? So what we mean by this is that we tell you that, okay, we can see to the fact that the government of Sri Lanka is inherently corrupt in the past, whether it be the old government with nepotism and so forth and so forth. So we think that even if, one, the old government were to resume into a new government, they aren't likely to continue what they've done, considering the fact that status quo, the civilians have overthrown them and have put check and balances onto them. So we don't think that even without conditions that they will just take the stream of cash into their own pockets, because it's more likely than not that they'll be entrenched again, right? So, and it goes without saying that the new government of the new politicians, that they also won't take they won't take what the previous government has done. So what does this look like on the nature of Sri Lankan economy, right? So we told you that if they wanted to put on the hammer to us and tell us that one, they will be inevitably corrupt, we don't think that accountability is something that coexists on both sides. We think that it's mutually exclusive, that a point in time where the corruption ceases, then the benefits exist, but they didn't even tell you how it's intrinsically a sole benefit that exists on their side when conditions exist that they will inevitably erase corruption, right? So we think that that's unfair. Thirdly is on intervention, right? How it would, we think that it's unlikely on their side either, considering that Western intervention in the forms of conditions, most likely than not, will lead to a puppet nation, if I put you in my substantive speech. What does it look like? It looks like other countries trying to use Sri Lanka to their own benefit, whatever country 2.0. Even on their side, we think that once you impose conditions, then it just becomes sanctions and it becomes another nation. So we don't think that conditions in itself will have Sri Lanka to stand their own foot of their economy, right? And lastly, about giving power to people and have people actually gain back what they deserve in terms of democratic responses, right? I've told you in my substantive speech in itself that people are already taking action with their own hand of even without another government or even without another nation stepping foot into the political endeavor of Sri Lanka, that the government is already overthrown. So we think it already exists, it's a benefit that exists on our side in itself. So we don't think that conditions in itself will hamper this to the head of making whatever these people want more in itself. The problem exists within the government, and since there is already an incentive for people to tell the government what is wrong and what is right, we think for all of those reasons, side love. Thank you.
Thank you to the representative from the government team for the reply speech. Ladies and gentlemen, we are now reaching the end of our session today. Congratulations and thank you to all debaters from both teams for your wonderful, informative and fruitful speech. Thank you so much for your cooperation and for your time spent here in this debate round. With that being said, this debate session is adjourned. Thank you so much and Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. All debaters, you may go to the previous roll room. Thank you.
Angin kencang itu menuntut satu kemahuan, menegaskan satu pendirian. Bahawa bahasa Melayu itu satu perjuangan kemerdekaan, lambang perpaduan kebangsaan. 22 Jun 1956, hasil daripada kesaktian lidah rakyat, kami lahir sebagai institusi keramat dengan nama Dewan Bahasa dan Pustaka. Angin semilir bertiup perlahan-lahan memupuk rasa cinta dan penghayatan. Kami percaya ubur perjuangan mendaulatkan bahasa kebangsaan perlu sentiasa disemarak